All right, grab the paperback Bibles at the end of the rows, pass them down to one another if you would, or take out a Bible app, turn to Acts chapter 6. In the House Bibles, that's page 887. So update, last week I shared with those of you that were here, we're a multiplying church, and we're always doing what we can to kind of send off chunks of people to start new churches, especially sending off people we don't like, and just send them in different directions, start new churches. Well, we had an intern whose name was Michael Bartlett, who interned here twice, actually, and he is now in Frederick, Maryland, and last week they launched a church called Collective Church. And it launched, and I told everybody that, but we didn't really have enough time to get info from them during the service to, in real time, tell you, hey, here's how it went. So afterward, we found out they had 271 people show up for launch, which is incredible. So super cool. Yeah, definitely. And one of the cool things that happened is there were people that were on his launch team, the volunteers that are just like, hey, we'll roll up our sleeves and start this church with you from the beginning. 3 of those people decided to follow Jesus, and what they did was they just immediately that night went and baptized them. And so they had 3 people decide that they wanted to follow Jesus. One of the cool stories was there was the community liaison who is kind of in between the church and the school that they meet in. They meet in a middle school. And I don't know or remember her name, but I know one of the things that they secretly worked out was that for every Connect card, someone who filled out their information for the first time, to just say, hey, here's my information so that we can be in touch as a church and with my family. They said for every one of those filled out, they would give $2 to this community liaison just to bless her as a surprise with money at the end of the service. And so a ton of Connect cards were filled out, and they gave her money at the end of the service, and she didn't see it coming. And really cool conversation came out of that where she was like afterward, like, yeah, I'm really ready to know what it means to follow Jesus. And so really, really cool conversations now going with her, who's just really kind of the representative from the school system. So Collective's doing great. Keep them in your prayers. Michael Bartlett, his wife's name is Ray, and their team in Frederick, Maryland. We're financially supporting them as a church. We're supporting them, and so we're going to be praying for them and cheering for them. So welcome to those of you who are at mochurch.tv. Good to have you. We'd love to have you come join us sometime in person if you're in the greater Cleveland area. Turn to Acts chapter 6. We'll be there in a moment. But how many of you, by round of applause, how many of you would say you're a sci-fi fan, just in general? Okay. So synonymous with where my nerd's at, okay? Now, how many of you, by round of applause, have seen this movie, Arrival? Okay, much better, much better. At practice service, 2 people had seen it, and that was a little deflating. And so this is one of the best film nominees for this year's Oscars, Arrival. So, it's a thing, okay? It's not just some obscure film. But the main characters in it, the main character is Louise, and she's played by Amy Adams, famous actress, and she's an accomplished linguistics professor. So language and communication are kind of her deal. And in the preface of a linguistics book that she's written in the movie, it says this. She writes, "Language is the foundation of civilization. It's the glue that holds the people together, and it's the first weapon drawn in a conflict." Now the plot of this film centers around what you saw in the trailer, the arrival of 12 massive black foreboding spaceships, these just weird-looking elongated eggs. They look like the rebel transport that rescued people from the planet Hoth at the beginning of Empire Strikes Back. There's a nerd reference for you. And so they have these 12 massive spaceships that appear in 12 different locations around Earth. Okay, and one of those locations is in the U.S., out in the middle of nowhere in Montana. Well, soon after this arrival, Louise is visited by U.S. Army Colonel G.T. Weber, who's interested in her expertise. He shows up in her office at a university and he says, "You're at the top of everyone's list when it comes to translations. I have something I need you to translate for me." And he plays audio of this warbled audio of aliens potentially trying to communicate with us or with one another. And in awe, she asks, because this has been all over the news, she asks, "Is that them?" And he said, "How would you approach translating what you just heard?" And Louise says, well, I mean, it'd be impossible for me to do that through an audio file. Like this isn't just some foreign language on earth. Like I would have to be there and see them in order to even potentially have the hope of translating or communicating with them. I would have to witness their exchange in person to have a shot at understanding. And the colonel looks at it real suspiciously, says, I see what you're doing. Because everyone in government with high clearance wants to be in Montana right now. Like everyone wants to see the spaceship. And he says, I know what you're doing. And she says, what am I doing? What am I doing? Like I need to see them. He says, I'm not taking you to Montana. And he threatens to pursue the help of what's highly implied is her competitor. Like I'm going to go to this other university, I'm going to talk to this guy. And so as he leaves the office and says, this is your chance, I'm walking out the door. And she's like, I don't know what to tell you. Like I couldn't really give you an accurate translation without being there to see them interact. And he heads out the door, and as he leaves, Louise pleads with him and says, before you commit to him, this other guy, ask him the Sanskrit word for war and its translation. Now, Sanskrit's like an ancient and medieval language from India, and he's like, hey, ask him what's the Sanskrit word for war and its translation. So he leaves. Well, later on, he shows up again at her house. The colonel does. He comes by helicopter. He lands in her yard, and he goes to her door, and he says, this other linguist said that the Sanskrit word for war is gavisti, which means an argument. And the colonel asks, how do you translate it? She says, it means a desire for more cows. And he says, pack your bags, we're going to Montana. Now, let me break down what happens here, because that's really kind of a fundamental point that this whole movie really unpacks, is this little thing that happens right there. Basically, based on these two parallel translations for the Sanskrit word, ask him what the word for war is. It's gavisti. What's it mean? An argument. What do you think it means? A desire for more cows. She's basically saying, picture like a tribal leader, for instance, goes to another group of people, and he shows up and he says, my people want gavisti. And Louise is saying the man is showing up to do business, to trade. He wants more cows, and he's willing to trade with you to get them. The rival linguist translates this as, he wants an argument. He wants war. He's come to pick a fight. And basically, your choose your own adventure goes from there based on how the person helping you communicate guides you and coaches you. So we're either going to go to war or we're going to trade, and we're both going to be better off for it. So the implication is that bad communication would be tragic in this situation. Well, ultimately, Colonel Weber, at the beginning of the movie, takes her and a physicist named Ian Donnelly to an army camp in Montana near the spacecraft to try to communicate with these aliens, to ultimately try to find out, why are you here? And are you a threat to us? Are you coming to hurt us? Now, I'll be honest with you, for sci-fi fans who haven't seen it, it's not a movie with a bunch of action. It's not like, hey, here's the good guys and the bad guys. And the good guys are going to look like they're about to lose, but then they triumph at the end and they win. It's not like that. But it's a movie, although it's not filled with action, it's filled with suspense. It's filled with this conflict that needs to be resolved. And you just sense the feeling that this woman Louise is feeling, like, hey, you're chosen because of this gift you have. This is something you're good at, but you are in over your head. And you just get this feeling of man, if I were called into this situation to help, I can't imagine what the pressure would feel like, knowing if I mess this up, it could lead to global war, or this could be an unbelievable moment for our universe and for humankind. And so how do you even begin to communicate when you don't even recognize the sounds or the symbols being used? Arrival is ultimately about that, trying to figure out, how do I communicate with something I don't even understand? Now, if you turn to Acts chapter 6, I'm going to give you some quick geek background here. Acts chapter 6, the book of Acts is an account of the first years of the early church, right after the resurrection of Jesus. And so one thing you have to understand about the first century church is that the early Christians were extremely benevolent, okay? They were extremely benevolent. They took care of their poor and needy in a way that should humble and inspire us today. In fact, just as a precursor to this, in chapter 4, it tells us this: all the believers, or all the disciples or followers of Jesus, were in one heart, were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. There were no needy persons among them. Okay? So for us, one of the ways that translates at Momentum is simply people who get involved in our small group communities. Man, it is really hard to know the stories and what's going on in the lives of everyone who shows up between our two campuses. But people who get in Mo groups, we say, man, when someone has a need pop up, whether it's a temporary need, whether it's something to do with they've lost their job, whatever it is, people in that group rally to them and make sure there's no needy person among them. So they rally to that person and help take care of them. And that's inspired by Acts chapter 4 there, just saying like, hey, let's rally together and take care of people when they're in need. So now, in Acts chapter 6, the church is only about 3 to 4 years old. It's only been about 3 or 4 years since Jesus raised from the dead. And in Acts chapter 6, just two chapters later, we see the signs of growing pains. It says this, Acts 6, verse 1. In those days when the number of disciples was increasing, that's important, they're growing, the Hellenistic Jews among them complained against the Hebraic Jews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. Okay, so we're going to pause a long time just to look at this dilemma, okay? So basically what's going on here is in the early Christian church, or just in general in the city of Jerusalem where this is taking place, there were two kinds of Jewish people. Okay, one, there was the Hebraic Jews. That means they spoke Hebrew, okay? They were from Jerusalem, these that were living in Jerusalem. They're from Jerusalem. Their mom was from Jerusalem. Their mom's mom, their dad's dad, their grandpappy, like everybody going back for generations, they had lived here in Israel, specifically in Jerusalem. And they spoke Aramaic, which is basically an evolved form of Hebrew, their ancestral language. And so they prided themselves on the fact that they weren't letting anything foreign into their lives. They were holding on to their family's heritage. Well, that's kind of important because in the 4th century BC, Alexander the Great comes along and he Hellenizes the entire world around him, basically. He goes around and he instills Greek culture into non-Greek cities and he teaches them their culture and the arts of the Greeks. But these guys, these Hebraic Jews, they're like, no, we speak our ancestral language, basically Hebrew, but it's called Aramaic now. And we aren't going to speak Greek in our homes. We're going to speak Aramaic or Hebrew. That's what we're going to do. And so these Hebraic Jews were proud that they had preserved their family's culture, and that was a noble thing. But there's another group of Jews living in Jerusalem at the time, and they're called the Hellenistic Jews. Sometimes they'd be called the Grecian Jews because they spoke Greek. They spoke Greek just like the culture around them. And the reason for that is because their ancestors had been dispersed around to other foreign places through the diaspora, Jews going all over leaving Palestine basically, and they go all out. And so for whatever reason now, some point, they've come back to live in specifically Jerusalem for these Jews. They're back in Palestine. And so they speak Greek. They speak what the rest of the world around them speaks. It has been Hellenized by Alexander the Great, and now in the Roman Empire, they're speaking Greek, so they were Hellenized. They spoke Greek as their first language. They probably didn't even know Aramaic. They don't know the ancestral language. And because of that, the Hebrew Jews, the Hebraic Jews, were very suspicious about these Greek-speaking Jews. They were very suspicious. By virtue of their birthplace and their speech and their culture, culturally, these Hellenistic Jews were more Greek than they were Jewish or Hebrew, and they probably tended to stay together. Much like immigrants or people who are here for a couple generations, they come together and they speak the same language, so they tend to huddle together, to be around people that they're familiar with and their culture and from their original culture. And so they probably tended to group together, the Hellenistic Jews did, because of their similar backgrounds in common Greek language. Now, the Hellenistic Jews were probably especially needy because they're new back in Jerusalem and they don't have a bunch of extended family around them. They don't have people from their family they can lean on. So they're probably especially needy because they don't have this help. And a lot of older couples were moving to die in Jerusalem, to end their lives in Jerusalem because they wanted to be buried there. And so now there's this great cultural tension that exists between these two types of Jews. You got these Hellenistic Jews who were basically considered outsiders. Jews who lived in Jerusalem, who were considered outsiders. Like they were considered second-class Israelites by the Hebraic Jews who lived there. And so the Hebraic Jews were kind of spiritually snobby, and they looked down on these foreign Jews, and they treated them as less holy. So now imagine this. Both types of these Jews start becoming followers of Jesus, some of them do. Okay? Some of them from each group start becoming followers of Jesus. And their minds are transformed, their worlds are rocked, and they start following in the footsteps of their Lord and Savior Jesus. But some of these attitudes and prejudices that were formed before following Jesus carry into their Christian lives maybe for a time until they're surrendered fully to God. And you basically have two different groups of people who are racially the same looking at one another saying, ew, they're gross, they're different. We don't like the way they do things. They speak a different language. They're totally different. In fact, they probably had in the same city two different worship services because they spoke two different languages. And so because of that, it's probably like all these awakened old prejudices and resentments rose up maybe in both churches. And one of them complains, the Greek-speaking Jews, hey, in all this benevolence of the early church, our widows are being overlooked in the daily distribution of bread. Our widows aren't being fed the way that the Hebraic widows are. And there's something going on here. Now, the truth is, it probably wasn't intentional. Like, the reason for it is alluded to in the passage, and that's because the church is growing rapidly. Like, you had this amount of people, now all of a sudden you've got this amount of people, and the Hebraic Jews who are in charge of things are accidentally overlooking some of these Hellenistic Jews, and so it's probably not on purpose, but the outsiders are being overlooked, and that's not good. And you can't even underestimate how damaging this could be to the unity of the church. For one group in the church to think that another group is discriminating against them, it's a big, acute problem. So I'm sure you guys can't imagine this, but try to picture with me. I'm sure you can't imagine. Picture two groups of people. And picture some in one of the groups feel that they're unjustly treated and frankly treated as second-class citizens. And let's just say some in another group might feel superior to these second-class kind of citizens and even feel like they're kind of complainers because they're always speaking up about feeling second-class. Now, I'm sure that you can't picture this at all, but picture, one of these groups saying to the other one, hey, you feel like you're being overlooked, you feel like you're second class, well, why don't you just move out of Jerusalem, leave Jerusalem, go back where you came from? I don't understand what you're griping about. I'm sure you can't even imagine what I'm talking about right here, but that's kind of the deal of what's going down here because their cultures and their languages and their approaches to life, they're so different that they don't communicate well. They're from different cultures. Racially, they happen to be the same, but they're so alien to one another. They're so different. Now, as you know, foreigners are often called aliens. That's disparagingly, offensively called aliens, whether they're resident aliens or illegal aliens. And typically the idea is that when something or someone appears foreign to us, that we're immediately suspicious. Like we immediately kind of stiff arm, keep at a distance because there's something about that otherness that makes us feel uncomfortable. Like that's alien to us, okay? It doesn't have to be someone who's from another country. It doesn't have to be that at all. But for some reason, that group of people, they feel alien to us. There's an otherness there that I'm not going to celebrate. I'm going to distance myself from them. That's why throughout God's interaction with his people and with mankind, he says things like he said centuries ago in Leviticus 19. He says this, when a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. God says the foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners when you were slaves in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And so this isn't to imply that minorities in America are still foreigners living among us. It's simply to say this: this is what humans do. God has been dealing with this for centuries. This is part of the fallenness and the sin of humankind is no matter what color they are or what ethnicity, whatever it is, they suspect aliens and otherness. You're different than me. I'm scared of that. I'm nervous about that. And one of the biggest reasons for racial tension in the U.S. between whites or blacks or Latinos or Asians or Jews or Native Americans or Middle Easterners is that we don't understand one another. We have different cultures often, and we don't often care enough to try to communicate and to begin to understand the different nuances of our languages and cultures. You know, one of the best examples of this right now is the issue of players kneeling in protest during the national anthem. Now, I just brought up the topic, and a bunch of you are ticked off immediately. Like, just so what is Dan going to say? What is he going to say? Oh, he better not pick that side. If he's on this side, oh, I swear, I'm not coming back to momentum. Okay, this is not a momentum stance thing. Listen, the veins pop out of your forehead like you're drinking a McDonald's shake as soon as this issue comes up. Okay? That's just how it is. And it goes back and forth. It's like, man, I think it's disrespectful to those who serve in the armed forces. Some of the players have said, when I do this, I mean no disrespect to people who have served in the armed forces. I have relatives who serve in the armed forces. And so people say, well, it's disrespectful to our flag. You know, some people say, well, yeah, but it's a free country. They're raising awareness about injustice, and that's the very freedom this flag gives them, is to protest in this way. And it feels like no one's actually communicating. They're just arguing on Facebook. You know, it's like, I don't understand that side, and it makes me mad. And I feel justified in my anger because I'm a patriot. Or I feel justified in my anger because of the injustices. And no one's listening. People just fighting about it and arguing. It's because we fear what's alien. We fear the otherness. Momentum is a multi-ethnic church. I mean, it doesn't always reflect in skin color, but often it does. But you know, we got people who are from families that are Polish and Bohemian and Serbian and Puerto Rican and Indian and Italian, African American, Chinese American at Momentum. We got Robert this morning playing keys, who just moved with his family from the Bronx in New York City. But he told me this morning he was raised by his grandparents in the Dominican Republic. And so we have many families and mixtures within families of some of those cultures. 2 years ago, we did a series called The Elephant in the Room. And it was basically like a series on 4 hot topics. Like, let's just go after some hot topics and let's just speak frankly about them and talk about what God thinks about these hot topics and all that kind of stuff. Well, going into the series, I had read books all summer on one of the issues that I thought was going to be the hottest of topics. And that was on the LGBT community. Like, okay, here we go, man, we talk about this. It is really going to get some veins popping out of people's forehead. Like, let's talk about, just this issue and how complicated it is. What I did not expect, I did expect the racism topic to be a big deal. I didn't expect it to be a bigger deal than the LGBT stuff, but that was the one where I got the mean email and the side comments and the people offended because Dan believes white privilege is a real thing. And just all these different things of like, man, see, but what you're not understanding, Dan, is, no, I think I understand that. You're just mad I didn't say it, that kind of thing. And so people were mad about that, like white privilege. I don't know about that. Okay, says the old white guy. All right. Sorry if you're the one that sent me the email. Man, I'm so mad about this. And other people hurt because they're like, man, like I really thought there'd be more support at Momentum once the sermon was preached. And I felt not as much support from people at Momentum that I thought I would feel for being a person of color. And there was a lot of like hurt and pain and stuff that came out of that message, but also a godly message toward healing and more unity. But this is a big, big deal, and it's because we're often just so suspicious of anything that's alien, unknown, that feels like otherness. In the movie Arrival, after just the second session with the aliens, they basically, as they showed in the trailer, like 5 or 6 people, humans, would go up into the spaceship, and they would have these sessions divided by glass with two aliens, which aren't even humanoid aliens. They don't look anything like us. They're not like Boba Fett aliens, okay? Nothing like that, all right? And so they got these things going on, these aliens on the other side of the glass, and the humans come up every 18 hours. They have a session, essentially, with these aliens. And there's a time where the colonel tells Louise, he says, hey, about those sessions, everything you're doing here in these sessions with the aliens, I have to explain to a room full of men whose first and last question to me is, how could this be used against us? Okay? Just the feeling of, we have to keep our guard up high, constantly dealing with these aliens, the otherness, what we don't understand. And that's kind of typical of human beings. Like, hey, we don't know when we'll be able to bring our guard down with these people, okay? But we're going to keep them up nice and high for a long, long time. And there's no vulnerability because we feel threatened. We live in fear. We're afraid to let our guards down and be vulnerable with one another. But ultimately, the movie Arrival is about seeking to understand perspectives and values that look alien to us. I don't get why that's important to you, but I'm going to try to understand. I'm going to try to communicate with you. It's about embracing otherness. And it all begins by learning just how to communicate with the aliens. There's a guy at Momentum named Josh Kaiser who would have been here this morning, but he blew out a tire in West Virginia with his family, so they're not here this morning. But Josh told me about a Harvard startup app that's called Hi from the Other Side. It sounds like an Adele lyric. But you just explain to the person next to you. And so it's an app that pairs up, and this is what they say, it's an app that pairs up nice people across the political divide to talk like neighbors, not to convince, but to understand. And so this app pairs you up with some random person who's on the other end of the political spectrum from you, and it wants to help you to seek understanding values and perspectives that seem alien to you and learn how to communicate with those people to you that seem like aliens. And it's a great idea. In fact, it's such a great idea, Starbucks got behind it. And they started donating free gift cards to the cause. And so now the app matches up two people, and it sends each person half of the information they need to redeem a Starbucks card together. They come, they meet at the coffee shop, they redeem the gift card, they get coffee, and they sit down and talk. And they're like, this isn't so that you can sit down and be like, you liberals are idiots because you conservatives are so asinine, because it isn't that. They sit down with a cup of coffee and they try to understand something that seems so alien, the otherness. And that's exactly what this movie is about. Trying to begin the difficult conversation to understand you're so different, but I'm sure we have some things in common. Our Garfield Heights Mo Kids coach, Nicole Gates, shared a 2013 Huffington Post article with me that was about cross-racial friendships. And its author, Deborah Plummer, has done a couple different surveys, one that ended in 2003, one that ended a decade later in 2013. But she says this in the article. She says, I'm convinced that race relations in the U.S. would only improve if there were more friendships that cross racial lines. The majority of Americans do not have friends that cross racial lines. And she goes on to say this. It's so interesting, but it's so simple. She says that people of different races, they enjoy the same leisure activities. Survey says they do. Okay? They enjoy the same types of leisure activities. And she lists at length, I'll list some of them for you. Movies. Oh, that's just white people that like that. No, it's not. Reading, eating out. Oh man, no. Everyone likes eating out. Live theater, concerts, museums, parks, zoos, sporting events, comedy clubs, horse racing, listening to music, playing an instrument, roller skating. I'm out. Water sports, internet surfing, shopping, biking, traveling, golfing, sewing, and crafts. She says, we have a ton of common interests, but we engage in these activities in a segregated manner. There's a glass between us. Like, you're alien, though. We couldn't possibly enjoy those things together because you're different. You voted this way. Your skin tone is this color. So we stay away from one another, and we don't have these communications going on that need to happen. Here's the deal. No matter what differences that we have because of political views or race or ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation or socioeconomic status, we also have a lot in common. There's a lot of things we have in common. Proverbs 22 verse 2 says, rich and poor have this in common. The Lord is the maker of them all. Like we're back to this, it's one race, the human race thing. There's a lot of things that we have in common. A lady named Vernee Myers, who describes herself as a diversity advocate, she gave an excellent TED Talk. I like nerd TED Talk stuff. But it was about how to overcome our biases. I definitely recommend it. But she says this is great. Biases are the stories we make up about people before we actually know who they are. Biases are the stories we make up about people before we actually know who they are. I see you, and because of your look or how you voted or whatever it is, here's what I think I know about you already. She goes on to say this, but how are we going to know who they are when we've been told to avoid and be afraid of them? She said, so move toward, for instance, this is like what she hones in on, young black men, instead of away from them. She says this, and I love this line, walk toward your discomfort. And I'm not asking you to take any crazy risks, she says. I'm saying just do an inventory. Expand your social and professional circles. Who's in your circle? Who's missing? How many authentic relationships do you have with young black men and women? She says, there's some young black guy there at work or your classroom or your house of worship, and you're nice. You say hi. I'm saying go deeper, closer, further, and build the kind of relationships and friendships that actually cause you to see the holistic person and really go against the stereotype. A couple of things she says that I thought were really helpful is she says, it's not about perfection, it's about connection. Let's just admit, as we try to connect and try to translate and communicate, we're all going to make mistakes. White people are going to be offended. Black people are going to be offended. Latino people are going to be offended. Somebody is going to be offended at some point, and someone's feelings are going to be hurt. But it's not about perfection, it's about connection. It's about making that effort to try to communicate and to connect. So, and she also says this, you're not going to get comfortable before you get uncomfortable. I love that. Like, if you want to say, I want to be comfortable with people of different political views or that act like this or that do that or a part of this culture, whatever it is, that's never going to happen until you first allow yourself to be uncomfortable, to embrace the discomfort, to walk toward what is awkward. And think of what you'll learn if you move toward the Middle Eastern person at your workplace, the person you avoid, that there's a wall, you bump up against it. I'm just going to avoid getting close to that person. Or the homeless guy in your community, or Indian people, because they have maybe a thick accent. And you're like, man, I have difficulty discovering or understanding what they're saying. Or the weird dude at work or at church, or a Pittsburgh Steelers fan. I know, but that's what I'm saying. You know, God even loves them, okay? And there is some ignorance there. There really is. But you got to love them anyways and move close, move toward your discomfort. I know the way they dress is disgusting. Just the gold and the black. It's just, it'll make you dry heave, but you got to get over that and just try to bridge that gap. Early in the film, so Louise says, I got to be there. I got to see him. I can't just hear an audio file and think that I can communicate with them or whatever. I need to be there. I can't understand them from a distance, is what she's saying. Well, then she arrives in Montana, and it's all hazmat suits and radiation detectors and decontamination tents and reports that China and Russia are mobilizing their forces and fears of being wiped out by a superior species. So when Louise shows up, her and the rest of the team start these communication sessions with these two aliens who later are nicknamed Abbott and Costello, and her hands are visibly shaking the first few times she goes into the session. It's discomfort. Like, the only way I'm going to get comfortable doing this is just to keep going in there, to keep trying to communicate. So when she goes in there in her first session, it's funny because these 5 or 6 humans, there's that glass, and they all stand as far away from the glass as they can possibly stand. They don't draw attention to this in the movie. It's just a subtlety. They're all way back here. But then eventually in the second session, very subtly, you see that Louise is the one who moves closer. Slowly closer, a little bit closer. And she comes up closer. And then eventually, disregarding the warnings of the colonel, she removes her hazmat suit, which they show in the trailer. She busts that out, and she says, they need to see me. Like, how can I hold up a whiteboard that describes to them that I'm human, but they can't even see what a human looks like? I look all, I got to bust this thing open and say, this is what a human looks like. Me, human. And she slowly does that, and eventually, she obviously embraces her fears, and she walks toward the discomfort. Then Ian, the physicist who's with her there, says, screw it, everybody's going to die, right? And he busts off his hazmat suit, and he walks forward, and now she's basically said, man, I'm going to get closer, I'm going to be more authentic and vulnerable, and it inspires someone next to her to do the same. In the Huffington Post article I mentioned earlier by Deborah Plummer, she says this. She says, I distributed a friendship survey across the U.S. and conducted focus groups in 4 major cities. Guess what one of those major cities was? Cleveland, Ohio, Seatown. And she said that shared experiences within cross-racial friendships was primarily defined by things like socializing in each other's homes, like through parties, birthday celebrations, and having dinner together. But she says this, I think it's really profound. She said, however, vacationing together, late night, early morning calls for support, borrowing money, and witnessing family argue in front of them are activities that are shared to a much lesser degree. She concludes, these findings suggest that our friendships that do cross racial lines lack the bench strength to withstand the intensity of a deep and honest conversation such as those provoked by the verdict in a racially charged case like Trayvon Martin case. Crossing racial lines in a friendship takes time to build understanding. It requires patience and learning how to trust. You catch that? Like she's saying, this is good that we'll eat meals together. We'll go into one another's home. But because we don't do deeper things together, we don't have vulnerable moments in front of one another enough. We don't vacation together. We don't make ourselves vulnerable to be like, dude, I really need to bum $20 right now. That kind of thing. Like when we don't have that kind of relationship cross-racially, then how do we think those relationships are going to stand up when there's a controversial verdict and you don't understand how the other is responding? You don't understand the culture, the values, those things that appear alien to you. You're not close enough to really get into those uncomfortable conversations and to embrace the otherness. Your relationships just aren't deep enough to handle that. There's a point in the movie where Louise says to the physicist, Ian Donnelly, she says, I feel like everything that happens right here comes down to the two of us. And what she's saying is she understands the pressure that comes with them having to be the ones to show the world how to communicate with what is alien, or the outcome is a potential global war. Like she's saying, this is heavy. I feel like it comes down to us. We have to show people how to value these aliens, and we have to show them how to try and understand and communicate. Here's just the honest truth. Most Americans aren't going to try. Most Americans, I think, aren't going to try. I might be wrong. Most white Americans aren't going to try. Most black Americans, most Latino Americans, you just go down the list. Most aren't going to try, but I think followers of Jesus should be leading the way to say, man, I feel like this all comes down to us. Like, have you had that sense through all these terrible news stories over the last few years? Have you ever had the sense of, I think the only hope for our world, for our country, is Jesus' people through the local church? I think it all comes down to us to show what it looks like to demonstrate racial reconciliation and all these things. I think it all comes down to us to be Jesus' light in our communities. And society is going to avoid pain and unpleasantness, but followers of Jesus need to walk toward the discomfort and know that pain will come and awkward conversations will pop up. That's going to happen, but we have to lean into that awkwardness if we truly follow Jesus. Don't look for a Mo group at Momentum, a small group community where everyone just looks like you, where it's the most comfortable necessarily. Like a Mo group is about safe places to build relationships and learn from each other and make mistakes and give grace to one another as we make these mistakes. To say, man, it would be nice if I could be in a Mo group where not everyone does look like me. And that would be a safe place for me to try to learn to build some of these cross-racial friendships and relationships. In fact, I think it would be a beautiful thing if at Momentum, every time there was a big bad news story that is just clear, this is a bad thing for racial harmony in our country, wouldn't it be a beautiful thing if every person with brown or black skin at Momentum, especially people that were involved in a Mo group, because again, it's so easy to be anonymous at Momentum just on a Sunday morning, but if every person with, brown skin, black skin, whatever, at Momentum received text messages that says, hey, how are you doing right now in light of this event? Like, how are you doing? One, that would communicate, here are white people who care. These white people reached out to me, and this white person is communicating, yeah, I'm sure this is difficult, and I'm praying for you right now, okay? And what about the person of color receiving that communication, saying, thank you, man, I appreciate that you're thinking of me through this and that you're reaching out. I know that you are different. I'm not going to let Satan get in my head and say all white people are like this. This is the way everyone is. I'm thankful for you and I'm praying for you also. Galatians 6:2 says, carry each other's burdens, and in this you will fulfill the law of Christ, which is the law of love. Like, what if we had that kind of multi-ethnic church where that kind of communication was going on? Back in August at an elders meeting, we asked Brandon Board, who's an apprentice elder. He's one of our MCs today. He's the one with the man voice that I say one day when I grow up I'm going to have a man voice like him. But I asked him to share how he was doing in August in light of the recent events in Charlottesville, Virginia. And he shared some powerful stuff with us. One of the things he shared was that he said, a couple years ago, when there was these high-profile police shootings, he said, I wanted to pray for black men in our country, for their protection, and also for them to understand their part in this. And he said, then when the policemen were killed in Dallas, I decided that each side needed prayer in this. He said, so I started praying daily for police officers, a prayer of protection, prayer that their hearts will be softened towards suspects of color, and they'll treat suspects equal despite of the color of their skin. And I thought, what a godly response. Because there's so much of the us versus them. It's either you're for black people or you're for police officers. No, that's a false dichotomy. It is not either or. It can be both and. Black lives matter. Blue lives matter. I'm going to pray for police. I'm a black man who's going to pray for police. I just shocked a few of you right there. Like, is Dan saying he's a black man? He's coming out right now? But for a black man to say, I'm praying daily for police officers, how powerful is that? That is the light of Jesus in this world. It comes down to us, the followers of Jesus. 1 Corinthians 12 says this, there should be no division in the body of Christ or the church, but its parts, meaning its people who perform different functions in the body, its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. Again, in the church, when one part suffers, the others should rally to them and say, how are you doing? Are you okay in light of what's happening? Does that make sense? Does it make sense? Yes. Like I think there are people in the room who need to hear you say, yes, that makes sense. Does that make sense? Yes. Like the church would say, there's an injury in the body. There's pain in the body. Let's move to support the pain that's in the body. Let me close with this, just say, the end of the story in Acts chapter 6, it's so cool. It says this, after this is presented, that these Hellenistic Jews are being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. So the 12, which were Jesus' main 12, they're kind of a big deal. They're the most influential voices in the room in Jerusalem. It says they gathered all the disciples together and said, it would not be right for us to neglect the ministry of the Word of God in order for us to be the one to go and start distributing the food. Okay, this isn't to say that's lesser. It's to say that this is a prioritization based on giftedness. We're supposed to be doing this. We can't also do this, or this is neglected. So it says, brothers and sisters, choose 7 from among you who are known to be full of the Spirit and wisdom. We will turn this responsibility over to them, and we'll give our attention to prayer and the ministry of the Word, God's Word, Scriptures. This proposal pleased the whole group. They chose Stephen. And it goes down, it lists 7 men that are chosen who meet those credentials that they listed. And it says they presented these men to the apostles who prayed and laid their hands on them, which means kind of a passing on of authority to those people as well. Now, I love this response of what's given here is because the 12's response is, most scholars say, what they did was they gathered the disciples. What disciples? The disciples of the congregation. What congregation? Oh, specifically the Hellenistic congregation. Those who spoke Greek, who had the problem, who were speaking up saying, hey, our widows are being overlooked. He gathers together that congregation and he says, choose from among you, okay? Choose from among your people group 7 people who are qualified to lead this thing now, okay? And what's interesting is you look down that list of what's called the first deacons or servants chosen in the Christian church. You look down that list, and sure enough, all 7 of those names are Greek names. Ah, that's very interesting. Because what the apostles are saying in this decision is, hey, we're going to let you choose, and we know you're going to choose someone from among you, and we're putting ourselves in a vulnerable position because now our widows could be overlooked. Okay? Does that make sense? The Hebraic widows could now be overlooked because it's all Greek-speaking Hellenistic Jews that are in charge of the distribution of the food. 7 Greek-named men are chosen, and they begin to take over the leadership for the food being distributed to everyone. What a beautiful example of Philippians 2, which says, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. So the apostles make it really clear, like, hey, who would know the needs of your people better than your own people? And this is the best way to say we're also going to squash any thoughts or accusations that might be there that this has been a thing of discrimination. It hasn't. It's just growing pains. We still love you. In fact, we love you enough to submit. We're going to turn it over to you so that we're vulnerable now. I listened to a TED Radio Hour, back to TED Nerd stuff. TED Radio Hour, I listened to this podcast. Anybody else listen to that? So good. It's Guy Raz, who I go to sleep to his voice often when I can. I turn on the podcast like, Guy Raz. Such a nice voice. And he talks and interviews people, and they play clips from TED Talks and all that kind of stuff. Again, I'm an undercover nerd. And so there was this one time where he had this interview with a scientist. Her name is, I will find it, Jill Tarter. She's an astronomer. And she's talking about SETI, which is an abbreviation. It's a general term in science for the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Like, is it possible that there is other intelligence out in this universe? We don't know. There's a good chance that there isn't, but there also might be. And so she's talking about that with him, and he says, man, we've been sending signals out for 100 years now, haven't we? Like out into space. And it was a really interesting conversation because in the interview, she basically says, yeah, through radio broadcasts and TV linkage and radars, these kinds of signals have been leaving our planet unintentionally for 100 years now. She said basically there's a noise bubble with the Earth at its center, and that bubble, as the sound travels out into space, is getting bigger and bigger. The radius is getting bigger and bigger of our noise moving out into space, which is fascinating. And just that if there's somebody out there, eventually they could hear all this noise coming from our planet. So turn down your radios, you know? And so I want my MT. So all this stuff is going out. And so basically, Guy Raz says, but what if some kind of intelligent life has actually been sending us signals? Like, what if they've been sending us signals and we just don't have the technology to detect those signals? Is it possible we're looking for the wrong thing? And she responds, oh yeah, unfortunately, that's absolutely possible. She said, suppose they're sending us zeta rays to communicate. She said, we don't even know what zeta rays are, okay? That's like not a real thing. We don't know what zeta rays are, but they're trying to communicate with us. Perhaps there's physics that we don't understand yet, technology that we haven't invented, but it's absolutely perfect for interstellar communication, but we're just too primitive to know about it. And I love this part. She says this, so what should we do? Should we just stop what we're doing? You know, stop using the technology that we have? No, I don't think so. She said, I think that any moment, you have to do what you can with the technology you have at hand, and then figure out how to survive, how to stay around long enough as a technological civilization until you do detect zeta rays. So basically just saying is, like, if you want to communicate, if you want to make a connection, if there's a possible connection to be made, then you have to just keep doing what you know to keep doing. Here's the shocker. This has all just been relationship advice. Cross-racial relationships just comes back to the same basic stuff of how we interact with one another. Like how we connect with people that we don't understand. Some of you have aliens in your household that you don't understand how to communicate with. They're called parents. They're called teenagers. They're called spouses. I mean, that's just how it is. This is just relationship stuff. You just keep doing the stuff that you know to do until you have a breakthrough. You know, you walk towards your discomfort. You invite someone over for dinner or out to coffee. You go to a Mo group every week. And you build deep spiritual friendships with one another. You serve one another. You encourage one another. You forgive one another. And you embrace the otherness. Let's pray. God, you never hesitate to say something to us that's difficult for us to hear. And God, I thank you for that. It's one of the reasons I need to be a part of your church, to hear difficult truths that at times they're in a blind spot. Like I didn't know that was coming. I didn't know I wasn't aware of this issue in my life. And God, I think that just the way that you build us up, that as a church we can see one another's blind spots and speak to those blind spots and say, look out, or here's something that you're doing. You're going to head toward destruction. You're going to crash. And God, sometimes we don't want to hear that, but sometimes we really need to. And God, I just pray that this is just yet another wake-up call and a stream of what I hope has been wake-up calls for all of us as individuals to say, we have to keep trying. We have to keep moving forward. We have to keep communicating and engaging and walking toward and embracing the discomfort, the awkwardness. God, thank you that you came to us. You approached us. You sent your son Jesus to come walk the earth with us, to empathize with us, to die for us for our sins. Thank you that you showed us your love in that way. God, I pray that we will be inspired to do the same for others, to go to them. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.